Hi, I'm Genevieve Clutario. I'm a historian of Filipinx history, of gender, and of beauty. So my understanding of beauty, and I use the term beauty as a somewhat capacious one. It includes the sartorial and fashion. And I know in a lot of other contexts, there's a separation of the two. But in my work, I use beauty to describe the different forms um, of personal aesthetics, because I see beauty as not just, you know, I, as something to behold or, something to admire, but really thinking about beauty as a kind of force. Beauty has a kind of power that can really elicit a lot of feelings like passions, but beauty can also be used as a tool to either describe or not just describe, but discipline and dictate how you should move in the world. So that's not just how you look or whatever you put on your skin in terms of cosmetics, but it's also your comportment, how your body should be carried, and how you should move, how you dress the body, that those are disciplining measures. But at the same time, beauty is a lot of work. It's a lot of labor. So this is also why I talk about, this kind of regimented or regimes of beauty that also a lot of other people have talked about it, but to kind of highlight the kind of systems and work that it takes to produce um, beautiful visages, right? Or like to produce beauty. So, when I am talking about beauty, I am talking about, yes, the things that you see, but also, also like beautiful, textiles that you can touch and has a particular sensorial experience, but also all of that work that goes into not only creating whatever beautiful spectacle or beautiful individual, beautiful garment, but also the work that goes into pushing out that kind of those kinds of presentations as on platforms like the beauty pageant. So like to think about pageantry as a kind of system, right? As an industry, to think about, making the terno and to, yes, think about the labor, the very difficult labor of design, of weaving textiles, of making up the garment, of embroidery, which is so painstaking, and is very difficult, to also thinking about the kind of labor that goes out in distribution, like how do you get it out there? What kind of consumption is happening? So my understanding of beauty is very capacious in that way, because I'm also trying to think about what beauty can tell us about power. So it is about disciplining forces, but it's also these different forces that goes into making industries of beauty, like kinds of just the way that beauty and fashion actually really penetrate the everyday. Like its presence is so it's ubiquitous but at the same time is also very spectacular. And I think that that tells us a lot about how empire works too, right? So this is also why beauty is so important to me, because it also helped me understand, it gave me this lens to understand that relationship between, that which is ubiquitous and that which is spectacular, and that those things occur together. And that's what shapes people's lives, and actually shapes, colonial life. Um, so yeah. So I think if I had to sum up, I would say, beauty is yes, it is about the sensorial. Usually people think about it visually, but I also am trying to get you to think about it in terms of like the tactile, and to think about beauty as a way of understanding work and labor, as well as these kinds of ways that you can consume, and produce it. So in the book, I have different narratives that really show how beauty can both be used to enforce um, particular ideas of gender norms, of what femininity should look like, but also what kind of beauty also becomes this way of putting out into the open these kind of constructions of how you want to be perceived. So, and that these kind of perceptions of how you want to be perceived are really important when you're thinking about imperial regimes. So, in particular, when you're having these transitions between multiple empires, and there's just like this, all these question marks, like what what is a new what is a new colonial power? What is that going to mean for people in the Philippines? Like, what does that mean for you know people's positions, and what is there going to be more ways to accumulate power? Is it going to be different kinds of subjugation? Like, what does that mean? So when you have these kind of question marks, that it becomes even more critical to kind of put a message out there of how you are perceiving yourself and also how you want to be perceived. So let me give you a couple of examples of how we can see these kinds of two ways in which beauty and power can kind of function. Okay, so one way of thinking about beauty and relationship to power, as I mentioned, is this kind of disciplinary force. So in this one example where I examine embroidery, for example, so this like embroidery, there's this embroidery industry. Embroidery had already existed in the Philippines for a very long time. There's a whole history behind different methods of embroidery, how it came to be. And it was both practiced as a form of business in terms of cottage industry, but embroidery was also seen as something that was a sign of femininity. It could also be a sign of, your status, like in terms of being a particular ideal feminine person, a ideal girl, an ideal woman who can embroider. But this kind of cottage industry was then capitalized on both by the US colonial government in the Philippines, as well as private industries, to kind of come together and find a cottage industry that can be used then for export, for consumption in the United States. So what they did then was look for laborers and producers who can embroider in a more streamlined way without actually having to mechanize needlework. So why don't you want to mechanize needlework is because, well, the thing that makes needlework in this particular time, like what makes it desirable is that it's handcrafted. So you don't want it to be machine-based because you want it to be made by hand, because that's what signals luxury. That's what signals like the height of like a fashionable garment. But at the same time, you want it to be cheap so that you can maximize your profits, but also expand your consumer base. Okay. So what does that if you don't have a machine, but you can mechanize bodies or attempt to. So there were a lot of efforts to kind of streamline embroidery in sites of discipline like colonial industrial schools throughout the archipelago, but as well as prisons, and in particular, Bilibid Prison. So in colonial industrial schools and Bilibid Prison, there are all these like documents about how to train women and girls who may or may not already know how to sew or know how to do fine needlework, but how to train them so that they can produce in a more standardized way and produce in a more in a faster time, and to also have quote unquote quality work. And so the way that these documents are talking about Filipino bodies is to say, well, they have to hold the needle in a correct way. Their elbow should be in a particular way. They have to be sitting up straight. Their posture needs to be held up. And so it's a way of surveilling the body, but also disciplining the body in a particular way, in a very strict way, not as a form of beautification of that Filipina's body herself, but so that the proper comportment makes her a better producer of beauty for somebody else's beautification. So in that way, beauty is really layered, right? It's somebody else's beautification, but that's dependent on the surveillance and structuring of the body of somebody else's body so that they can be workers of beauty. So this is also what I mean about like thinking about beauty and power within the empire, and that facilitates the power of empire because you're also contributing to the economy of imperialism, of in particular at this case both the US colonial state but also private investors, and that beauty kind of unlocks a way to look at the different strands of who's involved, and then who's facing the consequences and what kind of benefits and the uneven benefits that these kind of industries of imperialism have. And it's really like, for me, it was looking at it through this lens of beauty that kind of unlocked all of that. Okay. But there's another way to think about beauty and thinking about power, which is, as I mentioned before, this idea of performance and putting a message out there. So if you think about it, at this time of transition, you have there are people who had already in the Philippines had already accumulated a lot of power because of Spanish colonial or working through and negotiating with a lot of Spanish colonial structures. So you have these elites who, many of whom are mestiza, who accumulated a lot of wealth through kind of particular industries, for example, sugar industries. And they are, they have a lot of power. They have a lot of wealth. They are extremely moneyed. And here comes this new colonial power, and it kind of shakes things up for them. Okay. And they're wondering like what is going to happen and how can I continue to secure my power? At the same time, for the United States, they're kind of a new they're like, I mean, one can argue the United States has always been an empire from its very making in terms of the legacies that it, is coming from in terms of settler colonialism. But there's this new iteration that draws from that kind of settler colonial legacy and settler colonial techniques that is, trying to accumulate islands of empires in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And, in the global framework, the United States is seen as kind of new to this like game of empires, of these like global empires. So the United States also wants to put forth this image of power. And in particular, when we think about the United States of putting forth this image of power, this kind of gendered image is usually one of like highly masculine image. Like, it's like a little bit later on in terms of time periods, like you'll think of like Roosevelt and like big stick diplomacy, or if it's like the military and stuff. But there are other ways that empires try to perform its power and status. And white American women who were going to the Philippines were the agents of this. So they envisioned themselves as totally white and superior, having complete supremacy, as being more advanced, more civilized. And more advanced and more civilized also means more fashionable. And that they would be like the arbiters of everything like you want to aspire to be a woman, that these white American women would be that beacon of aspiration. But when they came to the Philippines and they met these elite Filipinas, these elite mestizas, you have this kind of clash of two groups of women who have various forms of access to wealth and fashion. And for elite Filipinas who had, because they're so elite, they had access to Parisian fashion. Paris at the time was considered for many as a center of fashion. They would go shopping in Paris. This is the time of illustrados, like where they're like sending their sons to go study in Europe. So they saw themselves as like super refined and also like closer to Europe. And Europe was seen as sort of like the center of like modernity and civilization and stuff. So these women, these elite Filipinas, sorry, I end up laughing when I think about it, but they what they did was they used their sartorial performances to show their wealth, and to show their fashionability, and to make an argument that they in fact are not inferior to white American women who are coming to the United States. And in fact, in a lot of the documents, some of the white American women, you can see like cracks in their own sense of self, and in their own sartorial performances, as they start to become more aware of the discrepancies between their different sartorial styles, that white American women were wearing what was kind of considered the white colonial uniform of the time, white cotton, white linens, and these like very sort of like late Victorian dresses that couldn't keep their starch. And like one of the documents, like one woman described herself and the American women she was with, as like looking like drowned rats. And then they're facing this kind of passive aggressive and sometimes just blatantly aggressive comments from these elite mestizas, who are saying like, well, where are your diamonds? Where's your gold? Like, why do you look like this? Like, I thought you were supposed to be the superior ones. And in these kinds of encounters, these kinds of colonial encounters, you have a particular kind of battle that's different from, it's not just a battle. There are battles. What it shows is that there are battles and encounters that happen beyond the battlefield, but they are also really important because this is where we see the kind of tensions of empire, the kind of tensions that you see in everyday life. That, as I mentioned before, Martin, thinking about Martin Melanson's work, like it's these interpersonal kinds of encounters that really get us to understand what's at stake, how people make claims to power, and that the presentation and beauty and the sartorial are so central to that. And they're not just how do I want to say this? What I try to argue, or what I do argue in the book, is that, you know, these aren't just symbols of power. This is how power is enforced and enacted. And it gets you to understand the multiple layers of where colonial tensions can manifest and how they manifest, and these really intricate ways that, I mean, when I was reading the documents, I thought they were so funny. But actually, if you take when I took a step back, I'm like, oh wow, this is really serious, because what's at stake is power. And then I'll just give one more example, and which is like thinking about, I have to return to beauty pageants. I'm always thinking about beauty pageants. It's my second project. A lot of beauty pageants happen in the second project. But when we think about beauty pageants, we often think about them as like colonial legacies, like it's a colonial import of the United States that like brought these kind of like, Miss America and, later on Miss Universe, right, to the Philippines. But if you kind of take a step back and you look at, for example, the work of like Doreen Fernandez, she shows that this kind of pageantry that has a very spectacular component to it comes from a lot of different sources in the Philippines and has already been a part of a lot of cultural and social practices. To be spectacular is also a declaration of power, right? And so when we think about the Middle Carnival beauty pageant or Middle Carnival Queen contest, which didn't start as a pageant, but started first as a queen contest, like it was originally used by the United States colonial administration as a way to fundraise for an industrial fair. So these kinds of industrial fairs were really, they were really important for empires. Like this is when you had world expositions. World expositions are, yes, declarations of your power on the world stage. It's a way to show off, but it's also a way of enticing investors to invest capital into colonial endeavors. And so the Middle Carnival Queen contest was initially a fundraiser to fundraise so that more investment, more capital could come into the Philippines for the benefit of the United States. And that was its original intention. But as Doreen Fernandez had kind of, shown, and what I take from that and what I continue to show is like, even if you have these intentions, things can go awry. And the beauty pageant, the Manila Carnival Queen contest, ends up becoming an unintentional by the United States, but this platform for Philippine nationalism and to construct what it means to be Filipino, even when, it was, there were a lot of strictures of declaring nationalism, of declaring Filipino-ness. There were a lot of strictures and censorship about that censored critiques of the United States. But through pageantry, through this Queen contest, there became this new platform to actually critique the U.S. presence in the Philippines, the unfair treatment between Filipinos and the United States, and they would talk about it through pageantry. So they'll say, well, in the first Middle Carnival Queen contest, if you look at the newspapers will say, oh, you'll have these write-ins and say, the Filipino contestant, she's being treated unfairly, but she's so much more superior to the US contestant. And then the rhetoric is all about nationalism. It's a sort of anti-colonial nationalism. And so, this is how, I, of course, think there are a lot of limitations to the objectification of women in beauty pageantry. Like, this is something that I discuss. And at the same time, beauty pageantry becomes this really important platform to criticize, to move against, to expose the hypocrisy of US colonialism, and to kind of forge a new Filipino identity. Like, Filipino-ness was was new. It was a construction. And it was a way to kind of galvanize people, and beauty became the language and the vehicle to do that kind of anti-colonial nationalist work. Yeah. Okay. So I have a lot of influences who have deeply impacted and shaped my work in various ways. The first I kind of want to think about in terms of those who've written about gender and Philippine history, Filipinx history, um, and that is Mina Rosas. Mina Rosas, every time I think I have a new idea, Mina Rosas has already written about it. She just has so much knowledge in thinking about women's history, about gender history. She has such a huge breadth of work. And not only that, she's also really generous, and just, you know, very generous with her, deep thinking, her intellectual rigor, and is also just like a really kind mentor. So I really owe a lot to Mina Rosas, and the breadth of her work. And kind of along the same lines is Denise Cruz. Um, I had to stop myself from quoting Denise Cruz all the time in my book. And I think for me, what Denise's work helped me do is also how to read texts and how to read documents through a feminist lens, and how to really understand the the sort of layered and multiple meanings you can extract from writing and from text, uh, from that, thinking about how does a feminist, and particularly a transnational feminist approach, lend to thinking more critically and deeply about a lot of texts that we can also take for granted. Um, and then Lucy Burns' work, she just helped me. I love Lucy's writing, and while her work is on theater and performance, and I don't write about the theater, she has really helped me develop an understanding of how to look at aesthetics and performance. And in particular, she has this chapter in her book on the Terno. It's called Your Terno's Dragging, and she's looking at a particular theater group and performance. And that while that performance is more contemporary, she really breaks down how these legacies of beauty and legacies of fashion really carry through multiple time periods, and um, and have these like long-lasting impact. Uh, and then kind of on the same lines and thinking about performances, of course, Martin Manalansan's work, Global Divas. He is the he had such a huge impact on me. I understood better how to think about gender and race as performance, and to think about performance not just things that happen on stage, but the performance of every day. And that's really so critical because that helps me think about people as agents of history. So not just sort of like big events and like famous people, but to think of everyday life as being really rich, and rich with knowledge and information that gets us to understand history much more. And so I owe that to Martin's work. And thinking kind of in this sort of lines of like aesthetics and beauty and performance, I think Mimi Wen's work, and especially her, she has this work on biopower and beauty, but she also worked on on thinking about empire and its continued impact. Uh, she has a way of understanding aesthetics and beauty and its power that really helped shape the way that I understand beauty in a much more capacious way, not just as something to behold, but as something to that's something that has a kind of force to it, which I kind of moving to a different way in moving away from aesthetics, but thinking about empire in Philippine studies and Filipinx studies, um, thinking about modern empire in a way that is recognizing both the structures of empire as these like huge forces with these kind of linchpin events or these pivotal events, but also understanding the everyday life of empire. I only really came to realize that through the following people that I'll kind of go through. um, and that is like the work of Alan Isaac and American Tropics, the work of Lisa Lowe on an intimacy of four continents. And then thinking about empire sort of transnationally is, the work of Kathy Choi and Augusto Espiritu, who really showed how to look at empire not just in one location, but to like think about empire's transnational forces, and the experience of people under empire in a sort of diasporic and transnational way. Um, and then that also got me to think, there's sort of like this other group of scholars who also got me to think about not just like discrete empires, but how empires overlap. And that what people experience empire, they also don't experience colonialism and imperialism in discrete ways, but through these like very messy um, overlapping of multiple modern empires. And so, for Filipinos, that's like the transition from Spain to US to Japan, back to the US, and just so many imperial forces that are really shaping Filipino experiences. And so people who got me to like think about those kind of overlaps are Vince Raphael, Gloria Cano, Raquel Reyes. Um, and then I just want to also kind of think about not just scholars, but also people who are contributing to the kinds of archival work that is really important, because archives is what I work with to like find evidence. And so, in addition to the archivists, like, at Ateneo Library, Waldet, like Waldet is retired now, but Waldet understood the archives so well, and it was only through her insight that allowed me to really get in there and to find sources that were kind of counterintuitive. So I think that, thinking about librarians and archivists as part of this endeavor of writing Philippine history, Filipinx history, is really important. And Mario Fair and his own personal collection of books, and all of the photographs that I have, majority of them come from his personal collection. He's just a wonderful collector, who's so generous and just welcomes anybody who's interested in reading and interested in Philippine history to enter his personal space. And so I'm really grateful for him. Um, and then I think kind of branching out of the textual and thinking of different like aesthetic documents or aesthetic practices and cultural productions, which I'm starting to think about more. The work of Jean Halandoni, she did the cover of my book. She's just an incredible artist based in Washington Heights in New York, Filipino American, working with huge textiles. She weaves her own textiles and tries to study different textile baking techniques from that she learned. from her own family, but also like doing deep research and like trying to understand like different, locations in the Philippines and these different textile productions. And her work really reminds me of Pasita Abad's work, where they just have these sort of grand, large scale, really moving works that are working with multiple materials to really create that sense of multiple feelings, but captures the kind of multiple feelings that you get from understanding different histories within Philippine history. So I wanted to sort of bring attention to the way that their work really resonates with me and the kind of work that I do. I kind of came to really understanding the force and power of beauty um, as a way to understand the different mechanisms of empire, but also the mechanisms of negotiating and living with and resisting empire through beauty. Um, because I was reading all of these new works about beauty from Asian American studies. So I should say that these kind of works from Asian American studies started making me more sensitive to, and also starting to think about the repetition of beauty and aesthetics coming up in the archives that I was finding, to take it more seriously. And I think so I guess I should say it in two ways. So the kind of thinkers that were helping me be very sensitive to this, but also like thinking about, different connections, are, as I mentioned, Mimi Wen, whose forthcoming book is something I'm so excited to read, because she's been writing about beauty for a very long time. She used to have a joint blog written with Tweeland too, called Threadbared. And I think Threadbared is really what helped me start to process the politics of beauty in a much more critical way. So Threadbared, I think you can still look at it. I think it still exists, but they were writing it while I was in graduate school, so it was like just a really important resource. And Tweeland Tu's work, both on Asian American fashion designers, and more recently thinking about thinking about skin as archive, as repositories of history, in particular history of war, the wars in Vietnam, like that, really unlocked, like her way of thinking about beauty really unlocked so much for me. And Minha Pham's work, thinking through a Marxist lens and really taking Marx and understanding of race and labor as really fundamental to understanding practices of beauty, but also beauty industries, beauty and fashion industries. Those are sort of like the works in Asian American studies that helped me really, like, it really gave me the tools to start to start understanding the accumulation of archival sources that I was finding about beauty. Because I think in the way that I was starting to gravitate towards sources about beauty, so I was kind of gravitating to two things in the archive, because I was interested in culture, was food, and then the other stuff was like aesthetics. It was like, fashion, the sartorial, anything have descriptions of how people looked, and beauty pageants, like those kind of things. I think were already kind of embedded in my understandings of Filipino-ness and Filipino identity, in particular because, I grew up watching beauty pageants, both as entertainment, but also as like sources of like understanding, generations around me. it was like something that I watched with my, not just with my mother, but with like my aunts and like my grandmother. And and when they watch it, like they, and not even just my aunts and my brother, like my dad was watching it, like, but they watch it, they take it super seriously. Like, you know, my mom's commentary on like if somebody's the craftsmanship of gowns and things like that, you know, it was already kind of there. And so like I think I was already like interested in this, and it was like something that I already felt like as really important in, you know, thinking about culture, Filipino culture, not just in the Philippines, but for, you know, in diasporic communities and whatnot. And so the kind of intersection between having those sort of cultural experiences and exposure, and then having this group of feminist, Marxist, Asian American writers, Asian American scholars starting to produce this work really came together, and is really the sort of start of how I think about, you know, my first book, but also, you know, my continued work, which is, I think, is always going to be about beauty. It's always going to be about beauty because I think that that's where I understand where power structures, everyday life come together. And I think it's really important to learn lessons of not how of learn lessons of how to not dismiss easily what is um, usually considered as frivolous. And I think these thinkers also help me understand that to take beauty seriously doesn't mean to always revere it in a way that is not critical, but to be critical is to take it seriously in its limitations, as well as what it can enact or engender. Like, I now I'm sort of talking, and I remember this one moment where I was in the archive and I saw this picture of, it was an old archival photo, and it probably dates 19 teens, I want to say. And it was a black and white, it was a black and white image, and it was actually a postcard. So in the early 20th century, you know, a lot of images that you can get from the colonies were mass produced, you know, and you can share them, you can send them back, like you can send them to whomever. It was like a way of communicating, but also um, it was a kind of particular kind of commodity. So anyway, so this postcard was a photograph of a beauty queen. At the time, I didn't know what really was going on. I didn't know who this person was. She was a Filipina, very mestiza, so very like white passing, mixed race, and then had this giant crown on her head with just so many diamonds. It was just encrusted with diamonds, and had this like really incredible gown. And the photograph was of her on a stage, and the on the back of the photograph was an inscription, like somebody had handwritten and say like describing her, and said, you know, this is, and then gave an estimate of like how much the precious jewels of like pearls and diamonds were on her gown and also in her crown. And then it said like Queen, and now I'm forgetting, like it's in the book, but now I forget the name. It said Queen so and so, Manila Carnival, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that to me was like a huge moment, because I felt like that moment and that image was so familiar. It was kind of what's the Freudian term? There's a Freudian term for it that I'm forgetting now. But it, you know, it was like that feeling of familiarity where I was like, I know this image, even if I don't know this image. And it was because I had already seen so many images of Filipino beauty queens. But then there was also an invitation to dig more, to like understand more about the Manila Carnival. And then from there, I just got really curious, and I was like thinking, okay, well, who is this person? What is the venue? What is this particular system of a pageant? What's the labor behind producing this photograph? Who's like, what is this consumption of the photograph and the postcard, but also like the pageantry and the performance? And I think that moment is really kind of what I was talking about, that sort of intersection between like this group of intellectuals who are thinking about beauty in a particular way, and also like thinking about, the kind of my already like embedded understanding of familiarity of beauty in a Filipinx context. It was in this moment where something unlocked for me. Yeah, there are so many works on the horizon that I am excited about, both in the perspective of the being in conversation with them from the work that I've done, but also learning from a lot of people whose work is teaching me so much, because I'm moving into the martial law period, and I'm moving into thinking about beauty as a political force to understand authoritarianism, but also resistance towards anti-martial law resistance. So the up and coming works, or not even up and coming, like these works I've just been like so excited about that's going to come out soon, kind of range in terms of how they've impacted me already. So first, I'd like to mention Christine Peralta. Christine Peralta's work on the U.S. colonial period is a work on gender and empire and medicine. It's a history of science. Like, she looks at botanics and like how Filipino scientists, work with the botanic to really create like new knowledge of how medicine works. She also looks at, the woman who created banana ketchup, because she was a chemist first, and how that kind of developed, as part of her labor as part of the Filipinx diaspora in Seattle, and how her background as a chemist really influenced, like her work in food. And so Christine Peralta's work, like, I'm so excited about. I'm also really excited for Izzy Miranda's work. Izzy is a musicologist that is also really rooted in history. So as a historian, like, of course, I love it. But I don't really know anyone else who can like look at arias at Filipino arias and like operas, and be able to dissect that as an archival and historical document. She just has such a range of skills and truly interdisciplinary work. And so, she looks at comedias and zarzuelas. So that's super interesting, and I'm really excited to see more of her work. In terms of empire and, thinking, like really pushing how we think about empire, for example, through militarization, I'm excited to see Juliet Nebelon's work on settler militarism. She looks at the Philippines as well as other sites within Oceania and the Pacific, and looking at that relationship between settler colonialism and militarism. And I think that book is coming out pretty soon. And along the same lines is the work of Kristen Oberiano, who is also looking at militarism, but specifically in Guam, and looking at the history of both Chamorro and Filipino immigrant communities who are really whose lives are so shaped by the US military, but also how their racial formations and also thinking about indigeneity, how this is so what indigeneity and racial formations can tell us about militarism as much as militarism, what studying militarism also tells us about the formations of these communities. And also, she does this incredible work that looks at various forms of resistance against the military industrial complex in Guam, which I think is going to be really important. I think it's already important, but I think these questions are being asked sort of beyond academics and also pushing and how activists really can push the kind of thinking to broader audiences to really expose, what the U.S. military does. And then because my work is moving into martial law, I'm in conversation with a lot of folks who's I can't wait for their books to come out. I really think that their work is gonna really change. It's like their work is field changing. And so that's the work of Karen Hanna, Mark Sanchez, Joy Salas, the way that they look at martial law, but also transnational activism, how we understand human rights, how we understand authoritarianism and acts of resistance, both individual and collective in particular locations and collective transnationally is really important. And then thinking about martial law, Ferdy Lopez is like, I don't know how Ferdy knows everything, but she really does. She every time I mention any kind of person or sort of a tidbit that I come across, like Ferdy can tell me the deep layers, the deep narratives around that one person or that one document. And so Ferdy's work, which has already been, she's been writing for a very long time and performing for a very long time. I'm just looking forward to the stuff that's coming up on the horizon. And then also Robert Diaz's book that's going to come out. Robert Diaz's work on thinking about performance and the spectacular. I mean, Robert has the word glitter in his title, and I'm just like, that to me means everything. And I think that really helps me understand, he's writing about kabaklaan, and then looking at multiple kinds of cultural productions. So I can't wait for that book to come out. It's been long awaited, and I'm super, super excited. I think it's just, I could name a lot of other folks. I think we're in such an exciting field and an exciting time of work coming out, but also work that's just like super necessary, asking these really important questions that help us not only understand the past, but how the past is creating these like continuums and legacies that we're, really grappling with today. And so I think these thinkers, I just can't wait for their work to come out.